Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to hear is not just a speech. It's not politics. It's not opinion. This is a wake-up call. The world is changing. The lies are crumbling, and the truth, long buried under propaganda and silence, is finally standing on its own 2 feet. For decades, one story dominated the headlines. One narrative shaped the minds of millions. But now the veil is lifting. The world is beginning to see what it was never meant to see. From the streets of Gaza to the corners of New York, from shattered homes to global protests, the new chapter is being written. Not in ink, but in pain, in resistance, in undeniable courage. This isn't just about borders. This is about a system built on fear, collapsing under the weight of its own injustice. So I ask you, don't look away, because once you hear the truth, once you feel the weight of it in your chest, you won't forget it, you won't unsee it. Stay with me until the last word, because what's coming next might just change the way you see everything. The internal divisions within Israel have reached a point where they no longer represent simple political disagreements, but deep structural fractures threatening the unity and stability of the state itself. For decades, Israeli society functioned with an undercurrent of tensions between secular and religious Jews, between Ashkenazi and Mizrahi populations, and between Jewish citizens and Palestinian citizens of Israel. However, recent developments have escalated these tensions into full-blown societal unrest. The controversial judicial overhaul proposed by Prime Minister Netanyahu's government sparked some of the largest protests in Israeli history, drawing hundreds of thousands of people into the streets week after week. These protests were not limited to political opposition. They included military reservists, tech professionals, academics, and even former members of the security establishment, all declaring that the government had overstepped democratic boundaries. The once considered unshakable People's Army of Israel, the IDF, has shown signs of fragmentation. Thousands of elite reservists threatened to stop volunteering, which is especially significant in a country where military service is central to national identity. Our nation's military begins to question its loyalty to the state's political direction. It signifies not just dissent, but a possible institutional breakdown. Meanwhile, the ultra-Orthodox population, which traditionally refrains from military service and relies on state subsidies, continues to grow in demographic and political power, creating resentment among secular Israelis who feel they bear the financial and military burdens alone. Its internal imbalance is no longer just a cultural issue. It has evolved into an existential question about what kind of state Israel is and who it truly represents. Arab citizens of Israel, who make up roughly 20% of the population, remain largely marginalized and underrepresented and have become increasingly vocal against policies that discriminate against them in education, housing, and law enforcement. These ethnic and religious divisions compound the broader political dysfunction, where coalition governments are increasingly unstable and built on fragile alliances with extremist factions. The Netanyahu bloc has relied heavily on far-right and religious parties, further alienating large sections of the population and even drawing criticism from former allies. All of these developments reflect a state that is no longer bound by a shared national vision, but pulled apart by competing identities, ideologies, and narratives. What remains is a fragmented society on the brink of a deeper collapse from within, lacking cohesion, trust, and a unifying purpose. Geopolitical isolation is becoming an increasingly visible reality for Israel as its long-standing alliances begin to waver and its international legitimacy faces growing scrutiny. Historically, Israel enjoyed near unquestioned support from major Western powers, particularly the United States and various European nations. This support translated into financial aid, diplomatic shielding at the United Nations, and political backing on the world stage. However, recent years have witnessed a gradual erosion of this support, especially in the wake of Israel's intensified military operations in Gaza, settlement expansions in the West Bank, and increasing human rights violations reported by credible international organizations. One of the clearest indicators of this shift is the growing number of UN member states backing resolutions condemning Israel's action. Once limited to a minority of voices, these resolutions now receive support from a majority of countries, including some that were previously hesitant to criticize Israel openly. Furthermore, public opinion in Western democracies is shifting significantly. In the United States, for example, support for Israel remains strong among older and conservative demographics, but younger generations, progressive political figures, and civil society organizations are increasingly critical of Israeli policy. This generational divide is reshaping political discourse in ways that could affect long-term diplomatic relations. European countries are also reevaluating their stance. Ireland, Spain, Norway, and others have recently taken symbolic and legislative steps to recognize Palestinian statehood or condemn Israeli settlement activity. The International Criminal Court has opened investigations into potential war crimes committed by Israeli forces, adding legal pressure to Israel's diplomatic isolation. These developments indicate that Israel is no longer immune to the international legal and moral standards it once comfortably bypassed. Meanwhile, within the broader global South, sympathy for Palestine has solidified into active diplomatic and economic movements. Countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia are strengthening bilateral ties with the Palestinian Authority and are increasingly vocal at international forums. The Abraham Accords, once hailed as a breakthrough in normalizing Israel's regional standing, are also facing backlash as the Gaza conflict reignites solidarity across the Arab and Muslim world. All of this culminates in a scenario where Israel finds itself losing the unconditional support it once enjoyed. The narrative of Israel as a democratic beacon is being replaced with that of an occupying power under international scrutiny, leading to its slow but definite geopolitical isolation. Palestinian resistance is no longer fragmented or limited to symbolic defiance. It has evolved into a more unified, strategic, and determined movement that continues to grow despite overwhelming odds. In both Gaza and the West Bank, resistance is no longer confined to isolated groups, but is becoming increasingly coordinated across territories and factions. Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and even local militias in Jenin and Nablus are displaying unprecedented levels of cooperation, adapting tactics, and responding to Israeli operations with surprising resilience. The intensity and sophistication of their operations, from tunnel warfare to drone usage and synchronized rocket bargages, reflect a resistance that has matured tactically and psychologically. Beyond the battlefield, resistance is also being waged through civil society, media, and diplomacy. Palestinian voices are becoming louder and clearer on global platforms, countering long-held narratives that painted them only as aggressive. Social media has amplified the reach of Palestinian stories, with young activists using platforms like Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok to document violations, challenge misinformation, and mobilize international support. These digital warriors are shaping perceptions across generations, turning global sympathy into solidarity, and influencing political discourse in countries far removed from the region. Inside the occupied territories, despite decades of military pressure, economic blockade, and political fragmentation, the will to resist has not been crushed. In fact, each incursion, each bombing, each act of collective punishment appears to deepen the resolve of the people. Children grow up witnessing injustice, and many mature into youth who are not afraid to stand against tanks with nothing but stones or phone. Cultural resistance through poetry, music, art, and education continues to preserve identity and sustain hope. Meanwhile, international support for Palestinian resistance is no longer limited to a few sympathetic states or activists. As protests in Western capitals, student movements on university campuses, and boycotts of companies complicit in occupation practices all reflect the growing global conscience. Legal efforts are being pursued in international courts. In the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS movement has gained traction in mainstream conversation. This multifaceted resistance, armed, cultural, legal, digital, is converging into a powerful force that Israel can no longer ignore or suppress without consequences. What was once seen as an isolated and weak struggle is now an increasingly strategic and globally supported movement that is reshaping the dynamics of the conflict and accelerating the narrative of Israeli decline. Israel's economic foundation, long considered one of its greatest strengths, is now showing signs of serious vulnerability as multiple pressure points converge simultaneously. The ongoing military operations, especially prolonged engagements in Gaza and along the northern borders, are placing immense strain on the national budget. Billions of dollars being funneled into defense spending, emergency mobilizations, and infrastructure repair, while critical sectors like education, healthcare, and public services face neglect or cuts. This misallocation is not just unsustainable, it's beginning to erode public confidence in the government's long-term economic management. At the same time, the political instability and internal unrest have severely affected investor sentiment. The tech industry, which has been the engine of Israel's economic growth and its primary link to global markets, is experiencing uncertainty. Major firms and investors have either paused their activities or begun relocating capital and talent abroad due to fears of judicial overreach, corruption, and authoritarian drift. When your brightest minds and biggest earners begin to question the country's direction, it signals more than temporary discomfort. It reflects a long-term threat to economic sustainability. Tourism, another vital source of revenue, has also suffered a significant blow. With recurring wars, global condemnation, and travel advisories issued by multiple countries, Israel has seen a steep decline in tourist numbers. Cultural and religious tourism, once a steady and lucrative flow of income, is being replaced by caution and avoidance. The perception of Israel as a safe, advanced, and thriving economy is rapidly being replaced by a sense of volatility, tension, and decay. On top of that, international economic pressure is mounting. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions BDS movement, once marginal, is gaining momentum across the globe. European firms, academic institutions, and human rights organizations are increasingly reconsidering their financial ties with Israeli businesses, particularly those linked to settlement activities and defense contracts. These boycotts may not yet be crippling, but they are growing in influence and legitimacy. Economic inequality inside Israel is another destabilizing factor. While a small elite continues to benefit from military contracts and high-tech wealth, large sections of the population, especially in the periphery and among minority communities, are facing rising costs of living and stagnating wages. This growing gap is breeding resentment and creating a social atmosphere ripe for unrest. When you add these layers together, military overspending, investment flight, tourism collapse, global pressure and inequality, the portrait of economic decline becomes impossible to ignore. The growing strategic alignment between Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas has formed a formidable triad that is steadily reshaping the military landscape in the Middle East and directly challenging Israel's long-standing dominance in the region. This alliance is not just ideological. It is increasingly operational and coordinated. Iran provides the backbone, supplying funding, training, and sophisticated weaponry to both Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. These groups, once viewed as localized threats, now function as extensions of a larger regional strategy aimed at surrounding and exhausting Israel through persistent multi-front pressure. Hezbollah, with its vast arsenal of precision-guided missiles, has transformed southern Lebanon into a constant northern threat. Its forces are battle-hardened from years of fighting in Syria and possess intelligence capabilities and technological tools that rival state actors. Any significant confrontation in Gaza now risks triggering a simultaneous northern front, which would force Israel into a two-front war, a scenario it has tried to avoid for decades. Recent border escalations and drone incursions from Lebanon are evidence that Hezbollah is not merely issuing rhetorical threats, but actively preparing for conflict. Hamas, meanwhile, has become more militarily advanced and politically astute. Despite Israel's repeated military campaigns in Gaza, Hamas has rebuilt its tunnel networks, enhanced its rocket range, and improved coordination with other Palestinian factions. Its leadership is now more integrated with regional actors, receiving tactical support and strategic advice from Iran and Hezbollah. Like I said, this has created a southern front that can launch intense, sustained offensives that Israel struggles to fully contain. Iran plays a central role not only as a supplier of resources, but also as a master strategist. So with Quds Force and IRGC, Iran has embedded itself across the region from Syria to Iraq and Yemen, enabling it to launch proxy threats that keep Israel on constant alert. Iran's growing influences means Israel can no longer isolate a conflict to one border or one adversary. Each confrontation risks setting off a chain reaction across multiple fronts, overwhelming Israel's air defenses, manpower, and public morale. This triad, backed by shared intelligence, advanced weapons, and ideological unity, has shifted the balance of deterrence. Where once Israel dictated the rules of engagement, it now reacts defensively, constantly bracing for the next strike. The psychological impact of this shift is significant. The image of Israel as militarily invincible is crumbling under the pressure of a smarter, more connected, and deeply motivated opposition that refuses to be broken or silenced. There is a clear and accelerating global shift toward justice and accountability when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and this shift is playing a vital role in dismantling Israel's long-held impunity on the world stage. For decades, Israel managed to position itself as a democratic outpost in a hostile region, successfully framing its military actions as defensive and its policies as necessary for national security. However, the global narrative is now rapidly changing. Grassroots movements, international human rights organizations, legal institutions, and even sections of Western governments are increasingly rejecting this narrative and calling for tangible consequences for Israeli policies and actions. One of the most striking developments is the widespread mobilization of civil society. From university campuses in the West to mass protests in capitals around the world, a new generation is emerging that refuses to accept the status quo. These are not fringe voices. They are students, scholars, journalists, artists, and activists who are shaping public opinion and pushing political leaders to confront uncomfortable truths. Social media has become a battlefield of truth and exposure, where video evidence of airstrikes, home demolitions, and civilian suffering instantly reaches millions and fuels global outrage. Legal accountability is no longer a theoretical idea. The International Criminal Court has opened investigations into possible war crimes committed by Israeli forces, and prominent international organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have publicly labeled Israel's system of governance over Palestinians as apartheid. These labels carry weight both politically and morally, and they are influencing how other nations, institutions, and even corporations engage with Israel. Economic isolation is being accompanied by economic consequences. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement continues to gain momentum not just among activists, but within academia, culture, and even sections of the private sector. Banks, artists, universities, and trade unions in several countries are reconsidering their ties to Israeli institutions. This growing wave of nonviolent resistance is delegitimizing the occupation and eroding the economic and cultural normalization that Israel has long depended on. What makes this shift powerful is its moral clarity. The global conversation is increasingly centered on human rights, international law, and equality, principles that transcend politics and ideology. As Israel continues its policies of aggression and occupation, it finds itself on the wrong side of this historical current, facing not just criticism, but a rapidly solidifying demand for justice and accountability that can no longer be ignored or dismissed. The cracks in Israel's foundation are no longer hidden. They are spreading, deepening, and undeniable. From within its borders, internal strife, political chaos, and economic instability are weakening the very structure it once proudly upheld. Outside its borders, it faces an unrelenting wave of resistance, coordinated, strategic, and driven by generations of suffering and unwavering hope. The geopolitical stage has shifted, and the once ironclad alliances are now thinning, challenged by truth, morality, and the rising tide of global awareness. As the world begins to reject silence in favor of justice, Israel is no longer just battling an enemy. It is wrestling with its own reflection. The final phase isn't marked by a single moment or explosion. It is the slow unraveling of a state that chose power over peace, force over fairness, and control over coexistence. And now history is calling for balance, for reckoning, for change. Thank you for staying with this message till the very end. May your heart remain open to truth, your voice strong for justice, and your spirit fearless in the face of deception. Wherever you are, whatever you believe, stand for what's right. Speak for those unheard. And never forget that even in the darkest hour, light rises. Stay conscious, stay courageous, and good luck on your journey for truth.